February 20th, 1943. The cold desert wind swept across the Tunisian ridgeline as Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt' command vehicle crept forward, its fuel gauge needle trembling on empty. For weeks, his 21st Panzer Division had been limping through operations, rationing every drop of petrol, stopping tanks in the middle of battle not because of enemy fire, but because their engines sputtered dry. To be a German tanker in North Africa meant living by the mathematics of scarcity, where every leader determined life or death. From his position above the pass, Hildebrandt raised his field glasses. At first, he believed the shimmering haze below was a mirage, another cruel trick of the desert sun. But as he steadied his breath, the vision refused to fade. Spread across the valley floor, row after row of fuel drums glinted like a dragon's hoard of treasure. Behind them, neatly aligned crates, tents, and vehicles stretched into the horizon. The abandoned American supply depot lay open and silent, waiting to be claimed. What Hildebrandt saw seemed beyond comprehension. Tens of thousands of gallons of fuel, carefully stacked in perfect rows, enough to transform his exhausted division into a rejuvenated striking force. To German eyes, trained to count fuel in liters and shells in single digits, this was wealth beyond measure. It was, quite literally, the difference between collapse and continued resistance. The depot contained 57,000 gallons of gasoline, more than his division had received in 2 months from Germany. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, intelligence officer of the Afrika Korps, would later recall with disbelief in his memoirs. "We found more petrol in one American dump than most German divisions had seen since El Alamein. The Americans fled and left enough fuel to operate our entire army for days." But to Hildebrandt and his men, the discovery provoked not triumph, but uneasy wonder. What kind of enemy could abandon such abundance? What nation could scatter wealth so casually across the desert, walking away from fuel that German divisions begged, fought, and bled for? As German soldiers descended upon the depot, the silence of the desert gave way to shouts of astonishment. Mechanics who had spent weeks siphoning drops from wrecked vehicles suddenly stood ankle-deep in petrol. Soldiers who had not tasted white bread in years tore into abandoned rations and drank hot coffee brewed from captured American tins. A private wrote later in his diary, "We ate like kings, but the joy was bitter. Our families starved in Germany while we feasted on what the Americans left behind." The captured depot offered a temporary salvation. Within hours, tanks that had stood immobile were refueled. Trucks once abandoned roared back to life, and units designated non-operational were revived as if by magic. Yet in that same moment, something else was revealed, something far more devastating than any battlefield defeat. The Americans had so much that they could afford to lose more than Germany could afford to use. This realization dawned not only on Hildebrandt, but on Rommel himself, who would soon inspect the captured stores. He said little at first, only gazing in silence at the mountains of supplies. Finally, he muttered words that his aide recorded. "Each American battalion is supplied better than our entire divisions. What kind of victory is it when the enemy can afford to lose more than we can afford to use?" It was a moment that crystallized the truth of modern war. This conflict would not be decided by courage alone, nor even by tactical brilliance. It would be decided by industrial arithmetic, by the number of gallons shipped, tanks produced, and tons delivered. In the desert valley of Kasserine Pass, Germany's SS soldiers discovered not only the abundance of their enemy, but also the certainty of their own eventual defeat. The depot glowed in the morning sun, as though mocking the men who had captured it. For the Afrika Korps, the victory felt like salvation. In reality, it was a glimpse of doom disguised as treasure. For the Germans, the supply depot at Kasserine was not just a battlefield prize, it was a revelation. In Berlin, logistics officers calculated daily fuel allocations down to the liter, sending convoys across treacherous seas under constant attack. Yet here, in the sands of Tunisia, lay the paradox of American war-making. So much abundance that loss itself meant nothing. German officers could scarcely comprehend it. When news of the captured fuel reached Rommel, he rode out himself, determined to see it with his own eyes. His staff remembered the silence that hung over him as he inspected row after row of untouched fuel drums, neatly labeled with American markings. At last, he turned to his adjutant and said with weary disbelief, "This is not war as we know it. This is industry." To the men of the Africa Corps, the irony was suffocating. In Germany, their families shivered through winters without coal. Their children ate bread mixed with sawdust, and their factories rationed steel. Yet here in North Africa, the Americans discarded supplies in quantities so vast that they seemed mythical. One lieutenant wrote in a letter home, never delivered, that he had seen more butter, canned meat, and cigarettes in a single captured camp than in an entire year of rations from the Reich. Another joked darkly, "If America can throw this much away, how can we ever hope to win?" But abundance had its own cost. The Americans, new to desert warfare, were clumsy and wasteful. Convoys were poorly guarded. Supply dumps were placed too close to the front. Inexperience led to negligence, and negligence offered Rommel his opportunity. The capture of Kasserine's depot allowed him to fuel his tanks, rearm his guns, and launch fresh counterattacks that sent the inexperienced U.S. II Corps reeling. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if the gods of war had tilted fortune back toward the Africa Corps. German tanks, long silent, roared across the desert once more, dust clouds rising like banners behind them. Reports came in of American positions collapsing under sudden armored thrusts. It was as though the desert fox had regained his bite. Yet beneath the surface, Rommel knew the truth. The depot was a windfall, not a solution. The Americans could replace what was lost in weeks, perhaps days. Ships from New York and Norfolk steamed relentlessly across the Atlantic, escorted by destroyers and covered by aircraft. Each convoy brought more fuel, more tanks, more trucks, an industrial tide that no desert victory could stem. Rommel confided to his staff, "We can win a battle here, a battle there. But each time we capture their supplies, they simply send more. For every gallon we steal, America produces 1,000. We are fighting an enemy who cannot be exhausted." In that observation lay the harsh arithmetic of the war. Germany could outfight the Allies tactically, but it could not outproduce them strategically. Every captured depot, every seized fuel drum, every fleeting triumph was only proof of the imbalance. And so, even as German soldiers reveled in their temporary abundance, a shadow hung over their celebrations. They were dining on borrowed time, feeding on the scraps of an enemy whose reserves were endless. The Kasserine depot, far from a turning point, became instead a mirror reflecting Germany's fatal weakness, a war machine brilliant in maneuver, yet starving in resources, waging war against a giant who fought with factories instead of foxholes. The paradox of abundance was clear. The very victory that gave the Africa Corps fuel to fight also gave them a glimpse of why they could never win. While German soldiers drank American coffee from captured tins and fueled their tanks with stolen gasoline, the men of the U.S. II Corps reeled from their first real trial by fire. At Kasserine Pass, green American troops had faced the seasoned Africa Corps, and the results had been disastrous. Units panicked, positions collapsed, and entire battalions fell back in disorder. For the Germans, the conclusion was simple. America was a clumsy giant, rich in material, but weak in will. Rommel himself, after surveying the battlefield, remarked with cold precision, "The Americans are inexperienced, but they learn quickly. Their material strength is terrifying. Once they gain discipline, they will be the most dangerous enemy in the world," and learn they did. The shock of Kasserine sent ripples through Washington and London. Reports described abandoned equipment, poorly sited defenses, and commanders caught unprepared for maneuver warfare. But unlike Germany, where losses meant irretrievable gaps, America could treat Kasserine as a lesson, not a catastrophe. Generals were replaced, supply systems were reorganized, training intensified. Where once convoys had been left exposed, they were now guarded with discipline. Supply depots, once scattered carelessly near the front, were moved with precision and protected by infantry. One captured German officer later observed with grudging respect, "The Americans we fought in Tunisia were not the same Americans we faced in Sicily or Normandy. They returned each time stronger, better equipped, and better led. We underestimated them and paid the price." Behind these changes stood the engine of American industry. While Kasserine exposed tactical weakness, it also demonstrated something far more powerful: resilience. Every tank lost, every truck abandoned, every gallon of fuel captured by Rommel could be replaced in weeks. For the United States, the war was not fought on the edge of scarcity, but in the rhythm of mass production. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago ran day and night, their smokestacks pouring out the real weapons of victory: engines, steel, and rubber. Ships launched faster than U-boats could sink them. Airplanes rolled from assembly lines in numbers that dwarfed the Luftwaffe's capacity to replace its losses. By summer 1943, the Americans who had fled in disarray at Kasserine were the same ones driving Rommel's Afrika Korps into retreat. Fresh divisions arrived, supplied with endless streams of fuel and ammunition. The tide had turned, not because of a single brilliant commander or battlefield maneuver, but because the United States had harnessed its greatest strength: abundance organized into power. In hindsight, Kasserine was less a German triumph than an American baptism. The depot that had once seemed to mock Allied weakness became a symbol of their awakening. The U.S. Army had stumbled, bled, and nearly broken, but it had not been destroyed. Instead, it emerged hardened, disciplined, and ready for the campaigns that would break the Axis. The message was clear. Where Germany consumed its last reserves, America simply opened another warehouse. Where Rommel fought on borrowed fuel, Eisenhower planned campaigns by the million tons. And where scarcity defined the Axis, abundance defined the Allies. Kasserine was not the end of American weakness. It was the beginning of American power. In the days after the capture of the American depot, Rommel's Afrika Korps surged forward with renewed energy. German tanks, freshly refueled, tore through American lines, and for a fleeting moment, the Desert Fox seemed to have regained his old magic. Reports of retreating U.S. units lifted German spirits, and Berlin broadcast the news as proof that victory was still within reach. But Rommel himself was not fooled. When he inspected the captured depot, he walked slowly among the endless rows of drums and crates, his boots crunching in the sand. Officers waited for a speech, a rallying cry, some declaration that the war could still be won. Instead, Rommel stood in silence for a long time. Finally, he turned to his staff and spoke words that chilled them. "Gentlemen, this is only a fraction of what the Americans have. We are fighting a war of resources, and in that war, Germany has already lost." It was a rare admission from a man known for boldness. Rommel had spent 2 years outmaneuvering the British across the North African desert, winning battles with speed, surprise, and tactical brilliance. But now, staring at mountains of captured supplies, he recognized that skill alone could no longer decide the war. For every gallon of fuel seized at Kasserine, America could ship 1,000 more. For every tank destroyed, Detroit could build 2 replacements. Even if Rommel crushed the Americans in Tunisia, more divisions would arrive, carried by convoys across the Atlantic that Germany could not stop. This understanding gnawed at him. Rommel had always believed in decisive battles, in striking hard and fast before the enemy could bring its strength to bear. But Kasserine revealed a cruel truth. Against America, there could be no decisive battle. Their strength was not in a single army or a single front, but in an endless flow of material that stretched from factory to battlefield. In private letters to his wife, Rommel confessed his despair. He described how German soldiers marveled at the abundance of captured rations, eating white bread and butter they had not tasted in years, while their families in Germany stood in bread lines. He noted the irony that his men fought harder after feasting on American supplies than they ever had on German rations, and he admitted, with uncharacteristic resignation, that this war was unwinnable. Meanwhile, Berlin continued to demand miracles. Hitler spoke of holding North Africa at all costs, but Rommel knew it was fantasy. Each battle consumed irreplaceable fuel and ammunition. Each victory left his army weaker, not stronger. The Americans, by contrast, grew more experienced with every defeat. Rommel's adjutant later recalled a moment as they departed the depot. The field marshal looked once more at the towering stacks of fuel drums and muttered under his breath, "We are fighting giants, and our swords are made of paper." The abundance of Kasserine was not a blessing. It was a warning. To Rommel, it revealed the shape of the future. A war where German courage would drown beneath American production, where every tactical triumph would be swallowed by the tide of industrial war. And though his men still believed in his genius, Rommel himself carried the heavy knowledge that no maneuver, no victory, and no depot captured in the desert could alter the final outcome. By March 1943, the fuel drums seized at Kasserine were nearly empty. The short-lived surge of strength they had provided dissolved back into the old reality. Tanks idling for lack of petrol, convoys stranded in the desert, artillery silent for want of shells. What had once seemed like salvation was revealed as nothing more than borrowed time. Rommel knew it. He had seen the truth at Kasserine, that US industrial might could replace in weeks what Germany could not replace in months. He urged Berlin to withdraw from North Africa entirely, warning that to remain was to invite disaster. But Hitler refused. To the Führer, retreat was weakness. To Rommel, it was simple arithmetic. Meanwhile, the Americans returned to the battlefield transformed. Gone was the disorganized, panicked two corps of Kasserine. In its place stood units drilled, hardened, and reinforced by endless reserves of men and material. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had replaced failing commanders, and under men like George S. Patton, the U.S. Army shed its greenness with ruthless speed. When the Allies struck again, the difference was undeniable. American tanks pushed forward in disciplined formations, their movements coordinated with air cover and artillery barrages. Supply lines stretched behind them in perfect order, trucks delivering fuel, food, and ammunition in a ceaseless stream. The same abundance that had once been squandered at Kasserine was now organized into a weapon. For the Africa Corps, the contrast was devastating. A German tanker later recalled, "Our panzers were lions with empty stomachs. The Americans' tanks never seemed to go hungry. Every day they returned with more fuel, more shells, more replacements. We fought until we had nothing left." Rommel, exhausted and increasingly ill, was granted leave in March. He departed North Africa with a heavy heart, fully aware that the end was inevitable. The men he left behind would fight bravely, but without supplies, bravery could not win. By May 1943, the Africa Corps, once the pride of Germany, was surrounded in Tunisia. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms, an entire army lost. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of temporary setbacks, but among the men who had seen the depot at Kasserine, the truth was already known. That abandoned American supply dump had been more than a prize. It had been a prophecy. It revealed the imbalance that no strategy or genius could overcome. A war of scarcity against a war of abundance. For the Germans, Kasserine was remembered as a fleeting taste of plenty, a banquet in the desert. For the Americans, it was remembered as a painful lesson, the baptism of an army that would soon drive across Sicily, Italy, and France. And for Rommel, it was the moment he understood that the fate of Germany was sealed, not in a single battle, but in the vast, relentless machinery of American industry. The Africa Corps was buried in Tunisia, but its true grave had been dug the day Hildebrandt looked through his field glasses and saw 57,000 gallons of fuel glittering in the desert sun. When the guns finally fell silent in Tunisia, the battlefield told a story more powerful than any communique from Berlin or Washington. In one corner of the desert, the wrecks of German panzers lay motionless, their crews long surrendered. In another, Allied trucks rumbled forward, bringing fresh supplies to armies already preparing for the invasion of Sicily. The lesson of Kasserine was not about tactics, it was about resources. For Germany, every victory consumed fuel, ammunition, and equipment that could not be replaced. The Africa Corps lived on the edge of starvation, dependent on convoys across a Mediterranean sea dominated by Allied ships and aircraft. Each gallon of petrol lost in transit was a blow to the front. Each destroyed tank represented months of factory labor in a Germany already stretched thin. For America, by contrast, loss was temporary. At Kasserine, the U.S. Army abandoned enough supplies to power Rommel's army for weeks, and still, within a month, they were replenished. Ships arrived daily, filled with more than the Germans could ever dream of. Abundance was not a luxury, it was the foundation of the American way of war. This imbalance was not limited to North Africa. On the Eastern Front, German divisions fought desperately to hold the line against the Red Army, but fuel shortages left Luftwaffe squadrons grounded and armored divisions immobile. In the Atlantic, U-boats sank Allied shipping, but American shipyards launched replacements faster than they could be destroyed. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Germany bled resources, while the Allies drowned the world in production. The depot at Kasserine became, in hindsight, a symbol of the war's trajectory. To German soldiers, it was a fleeting miracle, a feast in the desert that could never be repeated. To American commanders, it was a warning that carelessness could be costly, but also a reminder that mistakes could be corrected because their reserves were endless. One U.S. officer later remarked, "Kasserine was the price of inexperience, but we could afford the tuition. Germany could not." And therein lay the ultimate truth. Wars of maneuver could be won by skill, battles could be decided by courage, but wars of attrition, wars measured in tons of steel, barrels of oil, and shiploads of supplies, were decided by industry. In that war, the United States was the unchallenged superpower. By the time the last Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia, Kasserine had already faded from being a German victory into an American turning point. It marked the moment when the U.S. Army, bloodied but unbroken, stepped onto the world stage as a modern fighting force. For Germany, it marked something darker. Even in victory, the men of the Africa Corps had glimpsed the future, a war they could not win, fought against an enemy who could afford to lose more than they could afford to use. The fall of North Africa in May 1943 was more than just the surrender of 250,000 Axis soldiers. It was the shattering of a dream, the dream that Germany could dominate the Mediterranean, threaten the Suez Canal, and cut Britain off from its empire. With the Africa Corps gone, the Axis had not only lost a theater of war, but also exposed the fragility of its entire position. Kasserine was a prelude. In the desert, German soldiers had seen the scale of America's abundance. Now, across the Mediterranean, that same abundance prepared to strike Sicily, then Italy, and ultimately, France. Each campaign was supplied with mountains of material that dwarfed anything the Axis could muster. Ports brimmed with crates of ammunition, airfields swarmed with aircraft, and convoys stretched from horizon to horizon. Germany, by contrast, was already stretched to the breaking point. The Eastern Front consumed divisions by the hundreds. Factories were bombed night after night by British and American air raids. Oil fields in Romania became the Reich's last desperate lifeline, and even those would soon be under attack. Rommel understood the significance. When he later inspected the defenses of France in 1944, he carried with him the memory of Kasserine. He urged Hitler to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, to prepare for an enemy whose strength would come not from cunning maneuvers, but from overwhelming supply. He warned, "The next battle will not be won by tactics. It will be won by who can place more men, more guns, and more tanks on the field. Against America, that is not us." The High Command, however, clung to illusions. They believed new wonder weapons. The Tiger tank, the V-1 rocket, eventually the V-2, could offset Allied industry. But each weapon required fuel, steel, and time, all of which Germany lacked. America, meanwhile, poured out Sherman tanks and Liberty ships in such numbers that individual losses no longer mattered. The shadow of Kasserine stretched over Europe. The same imbalance that had doomed the Afrika Korps would doom the Wehrmacht in Italy, in France, and finally in Germany itself. At Normandy, the pattern repeated. German soldiers fought with desperate courage, inflicting heavy losses on the Allies. Yet behind the beaches waited an inexhaustible arsenal, ships unloading thousands of tons of supplies every day, air forces that replaced losses overnight, and reserves of men who could be fed into the fight without end. For the men who had once walked among the fuel drums of Kasserine, it was déjà vu. They had seen this story before, written in the sand of Tunisia. Scarcity versus abundance, a desperate army versus an enemy that could afford every loss. The desert battle was no isolated clash. It was the first chapter of Germany's slow collapse, a collapse not caused by lack of courage, but by lack of fuel, food, and steel. And it began with a depot in the desert that glittered in the sun like a mirage, except it was real and it foretold the future. By 1944, the echoes of Kasserine had become thunder. The very imbalance that had revealed itself in Tunisia, fuel, food, steel, and manpower, was now tearing the Reich apart from every direction. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army surged westward with colossal offensives like Operation Bagration. German divisions that once stood proud on the steppe now retreated in tatters, their tanks destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel. Veterans whispered the same bitter refrain. "It is Kasserine again. Numbers we cannot fight." In the skies, the Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German power, was reduced to a shadow. American B-17s and British Lancasters filled the air in endless streams, bombing factories, cities, and oil refineries. Fighter pilots like Adolf Galland recalled missions where they were outnumbered 10-1, fighting not just against machines, but against the assembly lines of Detroit and Chicago. Meanwhile, in Italy, the Wehrmacht dug into the mountains, turning every ridge into a fortress. But the Allies brought with them artillery barrages of a scale that defied imagination. At Monte Cassino, German paratroopers fought with legendary tenacity. But when the rubble settled, the Allies advanced, not because of tactical brilliance, but because behind them stood endless reserves of men and shells. Then came Normandy. June 6, 1944. The beaches ran red with blood, yet behind every wave of landing craft came more men, more tanks, more trucks. Eisenhower's armies were supplied across the English Channel by the greatest logistical operation in history. German commanders at the front watched in despair as Allied supply dumps grew overnight, dwarfing the meager rations of the Wehrmacht. One officer compared it directly to Tunisia. "Here in France, it is Kasserine again, only on a grander scale. We fight against an ocean of steel." By the winter of 1944-45, the mathematics were merciless. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble, was launched with the same logic that had driven Rommel. Capture Allied supplies or perish. For a few weeks, German tanks once again pierced Allied lines, repeating the miracle of surprise. But, as in Tunisia, their fuel ran dry. Panthers and Tigers stood silent in the snow, abandoned not to enemy fire, but to empty tanks. The Ardennes became the European Kasserine, the final proof that courage without resources was a dead end. When the Allies crossed the Rhine, Germany was finished. Factories lay in ruins, civilians starved, and soldiers fought with weapons cobbled together from desperation. American GIs who entered Germany were stunned to find civilians surviving on turnip bread while their own rations included chocolate, cigarettes, and meat. The disparity that had first shocked German soldiers in Tunisia now burned into the heart of the Reich itself. By April 1945, Soviet troops closed in on Berlin from the east, while the Americans advanced from the west. The German high command clung to fantasies, but the soldiers at the front knew the truth. They had seen it years before at Kasserine. Wars are not won by tactical victories, but by supply lines that never end. On May 8, 1945, the Third Reich surrendered unconditionally. For some veterans of North Africa, the fall of Berlin felt like the inevitable conclusion of a story written in oil drums and ration crates under the desert sun. They had known, even then, that Germany was fighting against infinity. Kasserine was not just a battle. It was prophecy. Beneath the sweeping movements of tanks and supply convoys, Kasserine was lived by ordinary men, young, frightened, stubborn, and unprepared for what modern war truly meant. Private Harold Jensen of the U.S. 1st Armored Division wrote in his diary after the rout, "We went into the hills full of talk, how we were going to whip the Germans. 2 days later, I had no rifle, no helmet, and was running for my life through the dust. We learned quick, too quick." Another GI, Corporal James O'Leary, described his shock at facing Rommel's veterans. "They didn't come at us screaming. They came at us quiet, like hunters. Every tank shell had its mark. Every burst of machine gun fire made sense. We weren't fighting men. We were fighting a machine that had been at war for years." Yet, months later in Sicily, O'Leary wrote home again, "This time it was different. We were the hunters. We knew the tricks. We had the guns, the trucks, the food. The Germans fought just as hard, but now it was us who never stopped coming." On the other side, Feldwebel Karl Richter of the Africa Corps recalled his astonishment when capturing Allied supply dumps after Kasserine. "We opened crates of food, real bread, tins of meat, even chocolate. Our rations were dried peas and black bread. We laughed, we ate, but some of us grew silent. If they have this much now, how much more will they bring tomorrow?" Lieutenant Hans Becker described the frustration of victory that led nowhere. "We drove them back. Their lines broke. Their officers panicked. But when the dust cleared, we had no fuel, no ammunition. We sat on the ridges and watched them reform. It was like striking a giant with a dagger, only to find the blade had snapped." Even Erwin Rommel himself, in a letter to his wife Lucy, admitted, "We have defeated the Americans in the field, but I fear it will mean nothing. Their strength is bottomless. Kasserine has shown me the future, and it is against us." The men who survived Kasserine carried its scars, not just in their bodies, but in their understanding of war. For the Americans, it was a brutal initiation, a battlefield classroom where mistakes were paid for in lives, but where resilience was forged. For the Germans, it was a warning whispered across the desert. You can win every battle and still be doomed by arithmetic. In the end, Kasserine was less about who held the ground and more about who held the future. In the years after 1943, Kasserine became more than a battle. It became a symbol, a mirror held up to two armies at very different points in their evolution. For the Americans, it was remembered as a humiliation, but also as a necessary crucible. Military historian Martin Blumenson later wrote, "The United States Army that crossed the Atlantic was brave but raw. Kasserine was the slap in the face that forced it to grow up." General Eisenhower himself admitted the shock had been personal. "I had assumed our troops were ready. Kasserine showed me how wrong I was. From that day on, I resolved never again to underestimate preparation." Indeed, the reforms that followed, better training, tighter command structures, a ruthless emphasis on logistics, traced directly back to those February days in Tunisia. Every American victory from Sicily to Normandy carried in its DNA the lessons of Kasserine. For the Germans, the battle was both triumph and tragedy. Propaganda trumpeted the rout of the Americans, portraying it as proof of German invincibility. But within the Wehrmacht, thoughtful officers drew darker conclusions. They saw that even total tactical success could not alter the imbalance of resources. As one general remarked, "At Kasserine we won everything a soldier could win, and still we lost." For historians, Kasserine has become a textbook case of how wars are decided. Not by a single clash of arms, but by adaptation, learning, and the ability to sustain effort over time. It is a reminder that strategy lives not in the brilliance of one general or the bravery of one battalion, but in the grinding, relentless machinery of supply and organization. For the soldiers who were there, memory was more intimate. For the Americans, it was the bitter taste of fear, turned into steel resolve. For the Germans, it was the sweetness of victory, soured by the knowledge it could not be repeated. In war colleges today, Kasserine is studied not for its maps, but for its message. That arrogance is fatal, that logistics win wars. That defeat, if faced honestly, can become the foundation of future victory. And so, in the quiet desert passes of Tunisia, beneath the sun that once glared on broken tanks and scattered helmets, lies a paradox. A German victory that foretold German defeat, and an American defeat that prepared the way for American victory. Kasserine was not the end of the story, but it was the moment the story revealed its direction. In the end, Kasserine was not about who held the pass in February 1943. It was about what the battle revealed. On the surface, it was a German victory. Rommel's Afrika Korps showed once again its tactical brilliance, smashing through green American units and sending them reeling. Headlines in Berlin celebrated the humbling of the Americans. Soldiers in the Reich believed, for a brief moment, that perhaps victory was still possible. But beneath the smoke and dust lay a deeper truth. The United States, though bloodied, was unbroken. Within weeks, its generals restructured commands, its troops toughened under fire, its supply system expanded. Kasserine was the sharp shock that turned inexperience into resilience. From North Africa to Sicily, from Normandy to the Ardennes, the American army that emerged was no longer raw. It was relentless. For Germany, Kasserine was the opposite, a warning unheeded. The Afrika Korps had proven once more that German soldiers were unmatched in skill and bravery. Yet, what did it change? Fuel still ran dry. Supplies still dwindled. Every triumph was bought on credit, against an enemy whose resources seemed infinite. The same imbalance that haunted Tunisia would crush Germany on the Eastern Front, in Normandy, and finally in Berlin. Kasserine is remembered today not because of who won on the battlefield, but because of what it foretold. That wars are not decided by brilliance in a single clash, but by the weight of nations. That defeat can be a teacher more powerful than victory. That resilience, adaptation, and logistics are the true weapons of modern war. The desert winds have long since covered the scars of battle. Rusting tank hulls lie buried beneath the sands. The passes are quiet, their silence broken only by shepherds and the cry of birds. Yet the lesson endures. In that barren corner of Tunisia, the world glimpsed the shape of things to come, the rise of America as a global military power, and the inevitability of German defeat. Kasserine was not the greatest battle of the Second World War, but it was one of the most important, because there, under the hard African sun, history whispered its verdict. Bravery may win the day, but resources win the war. In Tunisia today, the Kasserine Pass looks ordinary. Rugged hills rise against the horizon, the road winds quietly through the valleys, and villages dot the landscape where children play unaware of the battles once fought there. The desert keeps its secrets well, but if you walk the passes at dusk, when the light turns gold and the wind stirs the dust, It is easy to imagine what once filled this silence. The roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, the cries of men caught between fear and duty. Somewhere beneath the soil lie fragments of helmets, rusting bolts from tanks, and the bones of soldiers, American and German, young men who never saw beyond those hills. Their war ended here, but its lesson did not. For the Americans who survived, Kasserine was the baptism of fire that transformed them from amateurs into professionals. For the Germans, it was the hollow triumph that foreshadowed their nation's downfall. For historians, it remains the desert battlefield where the balance of the Second World War revealed itself with cruel clarity. And for us, it endures as a reminder that courage alone is not enough, that arrogance is costly, that the strength of a nation lies not only in its armies, but in its ability to adapt, endure, and sustain. 80 years have passed, but the whisper in the sand remains the same. Battles may be won by tactics. Wars are won by endurance. In the lonely passes of Tunisia, where silence now reigns, the world can still hear that whisper, if it chooses to listen.